was teaching introduction to a course called Basic Concepts in Political Philosophy. And I consulted with one of my mentors, a professor who that year was going emeritus at Illinois State University, John Geoghegan. And I asked him if he had any ideas for teaching a course, and John said, yeah, why don't you teach Machiavelli, Saint-Exupery, and Dostoevsky as a triad of authors. And I was 31, I had never read Saint-Exupery or The Little Prince. I actually had never read the book that he recommended by Dostoevsky either, the Notes from Underground. But I had read Machiavelli's The Prince about 6 times because we get subject to it in many courses in our undergraduate and graduate careers. So I taught it without really, I did the typical great books approach, is that I didn't really study at all the history of Saint-Exupery. I just taught the book. And I realized in reading it for the first time that this could be a very useful book for teaching freshmen at my university, because I thought it has all the marks of a book that's, on the one hand, they'll be deceived into thinking it's so easy that they won't study for the first day of class, and then I can give them a quiz in which they'll all fail. And then after they fail, I thought, well, then I'll be able to go through with them and teach them actually how to read a book. Like how to read a book where you say, well, at the end, there's kind of a question that's being asked. And the question, if you just give the obvious answer, so some of my colleagues would say, oh, The Little Prince, that's a book about the meaninglessness of life. It's written by an existentialist about the meaninglessness of life. And I just thought, well, that kind of an answer, Saint-Exupery had to know, because he had to know that kind of a simplistic answer would not be the answer to the book, right? But that a good book, when you read it and you get to the end and there's a jarring question like this, it leads you to reread the book. And it leads you to start to look for, well, is there a structure to the book? Is there a way to answer this question differently by the way he presents things in the structure of the book? So I just taught the book based on that, based on a couple ideas, basically, and I'll go into that right now, and then I'll say some other things that happened during the course during the 12 years in which I taught it as part of my courses. And what struck me almost immediately is that the book could be very useful for introducing 3 basic approaches to either philosophy or to political philosophy. The 3 approaches being: 1, rationalism. I think in the opening 6 or 7 chapters, we get a great insight into what is philosophy and what is the difference between rationalism on the one hand and what I would call like classical realism on the other, or classical rationalism on the other hand. I think in the middle chapters, where you get the encounter of the prince and his rose, and then the travels, and then the arrival at planet Earth, and then meeting the fox, I think in those chapters you get a wonderful description, a kind of an outline description of classical political philosophy, the fundamental motives for organizing political society based on a vision of the human person, with the culminating reality being friendship. And then in the final chapters, so after he leaves his encounter with the fox and we go back to his dialogue with the pilot, going back and forth with the pilot and his eventual disappearance, that's a great treatment for an introduction to the relationship between faith and reason. So I thought that The Little Prince, you can see an order to it, and within that order, you can start to ask introductory questions for an introduction to philosophy course, or for an introduction to political philosophy course. And just to say a few things now about each of those sections, because I know this is going to be more of a seminar, but to say a few things about each of those sections. In the opening chapter, the pilot is a child. He has a memory of his childhood. And in that childhood, he wants to be an artist. And I think it's very significant that there's a word that's used a few times in The Little Prince, culminating actually in the discussion between the Little Prince and the fox, before the fox and the Little Prince go their separate ways, where the word essence is used. And the artist, the pilot, who's an artist as a child, he draws what he says is a boa constrictor that swallowed an elephant. And as an artist, what is he doing? As an artist, he's taking some aspect of reality and he's trying to reflect the essence of it in his artwork. And then he shows it to grown-ups. And I think it's very interesting if you kind of look at first of all, what did the grown-ups recommend that he studies? And if you look at what grown-ups are interested in talking about, actually, I think one way now that I would cast it, something I've just learned in the last couple of years, is that you could actually cast the opening of The Little Prince in the context of the new studies that have been done in the last 4 or 5 years, 10 years, between right brain activity and left brain activity. Almost all the disciplines that the adults learn are disciplines that are a means to some end, but that's left brain activity. Whereas art, or then eventually philosophy or contemplation, right? That tends to be right. We understand that now as right brain activity. And so I think what you see in these opening passages is that the Little Prince, he's an artist, but one of the things that he's frustrated is that he can't explain what the essence of his drawings is to the adults. So you might say that the difficulty or the challenge here is that artists, and this is something that Plato speaks about, or that Socrates speaks about in the Apology, right? He says, when I went to the poets and I asked the poets to explain to me what they were doing in their beautiful poetry, they couldn't. Right? They couldn't give a coherent explanation of what they were doing. Right? So this is always the challenge of artists. That artists, through their artwork, they give us an insight into the essence of things. But artists have difficulty explaining why it is their insight is of any value or truth. And so this combination of things, the young man who's a child, who wonders, who sees the artist, who's kind of an artist, but when he meets adults who are interested in politics and golf and neckties, who want him to learn arithmetic and geography, more rationalist type or left brain type activities, he gives up, he gets frustrated. And his life is like this until he meets the Little Prince. And I think if you look closely at the encounters that he has, or the first days of his meeting with the Little Prince, what we see is the beginning of the science of philosophy. Because he said, first of all, he says, there are a few passages where he says that when he's in the presence of the Little Prince, he's in the presence of a mystery. In the presence of this mystery, the Little Prince will ask questions and he'll never let go until he gets an answer, even if he sometimes has to ask the question 3 times or 4 times, right? He doesn't get frustrated. And then the pilot also says when he asks the Little Prince questions, he has to wait, he has to be patient a long time, waiting for the explanation that the Little Prince might give him. So you have all in this opening description of the relationship between the Little Prince and the pilot, you have all the elements of what's necessary for, well, how do you understand a mystery that is true? How do you ask questions? How do you pick up on clues? How do you be patient in the face of maybe not getting an immediate answer? And as far as the Little Prince versus Machiavelli, I think part of what's going on here is that Machiavelli is operating, as far as I can tell, in a very nominalist framework. In other words, he's operating in a framework where he's basically given up on the possibility of knowing essences, of essences having any real meaning. And I think because of that, Machiavelli starts to develop a science of politics that is a complete left brain science of politics, and where the means essentially become the end. So you can see also, I think, in The Little Prince, just in the text itself, a beginning of a relationship between, let's say, what we would call natural philosophy or metaphysics and moral philosophy. And, you know, in other words, a relationship between these branches of philosophy, that what we think we can do, or what we think we're capable of, as far as providing explanations that give us insights into the essence of things, will at some point have an effect on, well, what will we see as the ultimate goal of organizing political life? In the middle chapters, where we get to the relationship between the Little Prince and the Rose, and then ultimately culminating in the relationship between the Little Prince and the Fox, I think we see that the Little Prince, before he leaves his rose, he also is lacking something. And he says to the pilot at one point, I would look at sunsets 40 some times a day. And you look at, you know, when you look at that many sunsets, it's a sign that you're sad. Right? So the Little Prince though, before he leaves his rose, there are some elements that we see of principles of organizing political life, or qualities that are necessary for maintaining political life that are present. So for example, he says there are the weeds. Now, when I saw the whole thing of the weeds and the baobabs, and you have to use discipline to keep the baobabs out, that reminded me of the first lecture I ever attended in an introduction to political philosophy class at Marquette University, by a professor who was a student of Eric Vogelin. And this professor began his political philosophy class with trying to explain to us, because back in the 80s, we would have these political philosophy classes where we would compare political systems, communism, fascism, capitalism, and we would compare ideologies. And so what he did is he said, well, one of the things in this intro to political philosophy class, he said, well, one of the ways you know a political philosophy that's an ideology is how that political philosophy would interpret the parable of the weeds and the wheat, right? That any political philosophy that wants to get rid of all the weeds, well, there's something wrong with it. Because our Lord says there's something wrong with it. So the Little Prince, before he leaves his planet, he's motivated by discipline. He's attentive to his flower, but there's something lacking because it leaves him sad. So he goes off on this journey that takes him ultimately to Earth. Now, when he visits the various planets, at least for me, visiting the various planets, I just almost immediately saw that this is a great setup for Book 8 of Plato's Republic. Because each person that he meets on a planet is motivated by a different passion which he lets dominate himself. Whether it's the king, who's motivated by power, the vain man is motivated by honor, the drunk is a form of pleasure, the businessman is a form of money, and then the geographer is a somewhat interesting case, because the geographer wants more information. But it's also the geographer, well, it's also in the course of going through these various potential ways of organizing society based on what Plato in the Republic will describe as a deviant form of political organization, right? The Little Prince discovers that his rose is ephemeral. He discovers an important metaphysical question that needs to be answered. And then Saint-Exupery also throws in work as an organizing principle, which is not a classical organizing principle, but certainly by the 20th century, it's an interesting organizing principle for society. Within the context of these adventures, the Little Prince figures out that, I mean, he falls into a kind of depression, because by the time he gets to Earth, he realizes his rose is ephemeral, but he also is afraid that his rose might not be unique. And that's when he meets the fox. And the fox, I think, gives him an introduction to, well, some qualities that are necessary for effective organization and effective leadership, you might say, in political communities, right? Because the fox essentially says he teaches the little prince, you have to tame me, right? He also teaches the little prince, the way you tame me is by rights, is through rights, right? If we have through certain rights, you can tame me so that we can, then ultimately, so that we can become friends. Right, so he introduces the little prince to these essential concepts of organizing political societies. And then I think what's really striking is that one of the most important lessons that the fox teaches the little prince, anything essential is invisible to the eyes. Right, that it's somehow through these rights, through taming me, through our friendship, that we start to see what is essential. And when we see and I think the little prince comes to understand that when we see what is essential, we have a superior principle for organizing. And also, he now sees that his rose is not ephemeral. Or that if he just looks at his rose, let's say as an adult, his rose is ephemeral. But if he sees his rose for who his rose is not ephemeral. And then the third section, I think this will be after the fox and the little prince meet. We go back to this mysterious relationship where they're looking for water, and then on the 8th day they find a well. When he drinks from the well, he has a vision of Christmas. And again, it struck me right away when I read, and I was not a priest at the time. I was a layman. As Danilo said, I wasn't ordained a priest until 2015. So I was, but it struck me almost right away when I was reading these chapters that they find the well on the 8th day. And of course, in the Gospel of John, it's on the 8th day of the festival that Jesus appears. And he says, he proclaims, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Out of his side will flow rivers of living water. And so I think this last part, I think these last chapters, I think they're chapters about the relationship between faith and reason. And that there is something that we can come to know about how to organize our lives and how to live as persons using reason. In other words, the right brain, just exercising the right brain, you can get yourself to the point of understanding the necessity of transcendence. You can get yourself to see that you have passions and how to tame them, right? Or how to organize them according to certain rights is extremely important for cultivating friendship. But then there's something more, there's something added to this. And it's not, if you're a nominalist, you might never see this because your left brain might never help you to see this. But I think Saint-Exupery is saying, and he's gesturing towards it in a very indirect way, but that these natural desires that we have, like thirst, there's corresponding spiritual desires. And there is a way also we can discover through questioning, through reasoning, through developing explanations for how to fulfill also the spiritual desires that correspond to the physical or material desires. So I think in the end, there is an important question, like how do you answer this final question of the Little Prince? And I think Saint-Exupery sets up a puzzle where there's two ways to answer it that I think he would find unsatisfactory. There's one obvious way to answer it that would put you in the camp of the adults, which there's another way to answer it where there's kind of an implicit danger of becoming an existentialist or some sort of a postmodernist, I think, in the book as well. In other words, to say, well, there's no meaning at all. And I think actually that danger would lead someone into a kind of infantilism, which I think is shown in the movie that came out on The Little Prince in 2016 in this country. Just to say a few final notes here, I found that the book was very useful as far as teaching Introduction to Political Philosophy and Introduction to Philosophy, and I also, it just so happened, I was doing a research project in 2004, and I was in Marseille, and 2004 is the year, and so actually it's after I taught The Little Prince that I began discovering things about Saint-Exupery that for me made the book a lot more interesting, and actually confirmed some of my suspicions. So in 2004, I was in Marseille and I opened up the newspaper one morning and they had discovered the dog. There was this article about how they had discovered the dog tag in 2004. They had discovered the dog tags of Saint-Exupery. And so then I finally did some historical research and I discovered that, well, yes, that Saint-Exupery, that he was in, when he died, the year he died, which I think was 1944, July 1944, he was in Corsica and he was running reconnaissance missions over southern France. And his plane went down. Sometime that year, they found a body that they thought was his, but they had no way of proving that it was his. In 1998, they found something that they thought indicated that his plane, that it might be his plane, through studying flight logs and things like that. And then in 2004, they found, by 2004, they had found both his dog tags, and they also had found the plane that they thought was his plane. They thought that it had, they found a fuselage that had the serial number on it that marked the plane that he flew in his last mission from Corsica to southern France, which was a reconnaissance mission. The other thing that was kind of bizarre to me is that I started getting all this flack from the curriculum committee at my university, actually to the point a few times of almost being fired for teaching The Little Prince. And right before I left Notre Dame, because I got another job, and I was always at Notre Dame kind of as a lecturer. I was not on tenure track at Notre Dame. But right before I left Notre Dame, I had a lunch with a professor who was hired at Notre Dame in the late 1960s. And he never knew what I taught. He never knew what I taught in my classes. But he asked me at one point, he said, "So what do you teach in your Intro to Philosophy courses?" He says, "Because, you know, half of our philosophy majors come from your classes. And you teach like 60 students a year, you know, 4 sections of Intro to Philosophy. And out of those, we get half of our philosophy semester, half of our philosophy majors. And out of the other courses, which teach the other 1,500 undergraduates, we get the same number of philosophy majors. So like, what do you teach?" So I told him I taught The Little Prince. You know, I teach The Little Prince. And then his jaw dropped. And he said, "Oh," and he let slip something that I don't think he wanted to let slip. He said, "That's why they're always coming to you." So that was like a weird statement that stayed in my mind for a few years. And then in 2012, I was leaving to go to Rome to prepare for the priesthood. And a book came out called On the History of Thomism in the United States, or the History of Thomism in North America in the 20th century. It was written by a French scholar named Florian Michel. And I read that book. I don't even know if it's translated into English yet. It's a long book. He did a lot of archival research. And what I discovered in that book, which again, in many of the years I taught Saint-Exupery, I didn't know this, but what I discovered in that book is that when Saint-Exupery came to the United States in 1941, he lived in New York and in Manhattan. And one of his friends was Charles de Koninck. Charles de Koninck was one of the leaders, and in Florian Michel's book, History of Thomism in the 20th Century, he says that Charles de Koninck was a professor up at Laval in Quebec, and that he was one of the leaders of the Thomist revival or the Thomist movement in the United States from the 1940s to the 1960s, early 1970s. And actually, so one of Charles de Koninck's students was one of my graduate school professors at Notre Dame, Ralph McInerney. And so the Little Prince, the model for the Little Prince is Charles de Connick's son, Thomas. So when Saint-Exupery was living in New York, 2 or 3 times he went up to visit Charles de Connick and give lectures at Laval. And 2 or 3 times the de Connicks came down and visited the Saint-Exuperys in New York City. And the origin of The Little Prince as a book is that in 1943, a publisher approached Saint-Exupery and said, I think you could write a book that would rival Mary Poppins. And Saint-Exupery in late 42 to early 43, he wrote The Little Prince. He was a man who actually, now to say some more biographical things, he actually, like, he met Charles Lindbergh when he was in the United States. He was a pilot. He was like an adventurer pilot in France in the 1920s and 30s. He wrote essays, which were quasi-philosophical essays. He actually did also crash in the desert at one point in 1936, I think it was, or 1937, in a kind of life or death situation. And he was actually also he knew many of the existentialist philosophers in France in the 1930s, who were the cutting edge philosophers of the age. He was also friends with many of the figures that we now say were part of the Thomist movement of the mid 20th century. So, for example, Charles de Connick, but he also knew Jacques Maritain, and he also knew Gabriel Marcel, who was a personalist. So when he wrote The Little Prince, he wrote 94 drafts before he published it, which I think gives credence to the idea that this is a book that it's not just like Mary Poppins. It's not just a book for children. Like he crafted it. And when he puts in words like essence and mystery, and at one point he even puts in the word contemplation of the mystery of the Little Prince, or when he puts in these symbolic, when he uses numbers to symbolic effect, or when you kind of hone in on what planets he's visiting and what's the desire of each person on the planet. I mean, I think his travels, who he knew, the essays that he wrote, it all moves you in the direction of saying this guy is much more than Charles Lindbergh, as far as his capacity for thinking things through. And that the Little Prince, he actually, I found another quote where he also saw that the Little Prince would be his testament for Americans. Like he also saw it on some level as a critique of America, like his concerns about America. The last thing I learned, and I learned this when I was in Rome, is that there's a fellow named Touze. His last name is Touze. Abel Touze, T-O-U-Z-E-T. And I learned this when I was in Rome. I came across his book. It's kind of this guy did research into the last days of Saint-Exupery. And one of the things he points out is that Saint-Exupery, the night before he died, which would be he died on the 31st of July, 1944, most likely. On the 30th of July, 1944, the last thing he did is he sat in on a catechism class on Corsica before he got into the plane and then went off in his reconnaissance mission. So there's more things to say about that as far as his own, let's say, his own biography. But I think all these little biographical notes, they all point us in the direction that I think he's leaving us clues for what he thinks is an important contribution and also an important way out of what he sees as some serious philosophical dilemmas of the 20th century. And I think with that, we can have a discussion.